Good evening and welcome to the State of African America, a town hall series focused on issues of particular relevance to the African American community. Tonight, we have an amazing group of guests that I will introduce in just one moment. As I mentioned, this is a series, a town hall series. Tonight, we'll sort of just talk about broad issues, but going forward, we'll hone in on specific issues like healthcare, politics, the arts, even our special connection to the continent of Africa. Tonight, we have, as I mentioned, an amazing group of guests: Charlamagne Tha God, Chevara Orrin, Ilyasah Shabbazz, Steve Benjamin, and one quick note to those of you who are watching live: feel free to use the chat function to make comments or to ask questions, and as time and availability allows, we will go to those toward the end. But as a way of sort of introducing our guests and giving them an opportunity to share a little bit about themselves and their path, I've got some individual questions for each of you, and then from there, we'll go to broad questions for the entire group. We'll start this off with a question. We will do it alphabetically by name for no other reason other than that, but we start off then with Charlamagne. So I gotta ask you, Charlamagne, you know, as a fellow Gullah Geechee person, first I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. But then how does absolutely, how does a Gullah Geechee boy from Moncks Corner, South Carolina grow up to be one of the most powerful and well-known figures in American media and popular culture? What's been your path?
Well, to answer the question, I would say God. You know, I keep God first. I stay humble and I keep working. I mean, that's such a broad question to even say how you get here. You know, I think that you find something that you love to do, you find your passion, and you just continue to work at it. You know, you continue to work at it and you end up in great situations. You know, and I've been blessed and fortunate enough to end up in a great situation. So the short and long of it is, yes, I'm here because God wants me to be here. I'm blessed, black, and highly favored.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Chevara, again, welcome and thank you for being here. You were literally born into the movement. Both your mother and father were social justice activists. Tell us a little bit about the influence of your family on you and on your path and your journey.
Thank you, Michael, for having me. I'm really excited to share space and conversation with everyone on this panel. That's a beautiful, powerful question. I am daughter descendant of both immigrant and enslaved. I'm the great-granddaughter of Samuel Rutsky, who set sail on the St. Paul from Kiev, Russia. He first touched American soil in 1902. I'm also the great-granddaughter of Burl Bevel, born into bondage on an Alabama cotton plantation in 1837. And both of my parents are civil rights activists. My mother, Suzanne, she's a white Jewish anti-apartheid, anti-war activist. She was the lead organizer of the 100,000 person march on the Pentagon in opposition to the Vietnam War in 1967, which is actually how she met my father, James Bevel. He was one of the key strategists of the civil rights movement, the architect of the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade. Along with Dr. King and Al Raby, he organized the 1965 open housing movement that ultimately led to the Fair Housing Act of '68. And he was the first to call for a march from Selma to Montgomery that led to the Voting Rights Act, which today, April 6th, right, 1965, we are celebrating. He was portrayed by Common in the film Selma, and all of that legacy, that work, the challenge of it certainly has informed my professional path and my personal passion. I will share that my earliest memory of activism was sleeping inside, curled up inside a concrete building tube across the park, in the park across the street from the White House, eating stale rice, sipping tepid water, protesting famine in Bangladesh. I was 3 years old.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Ilyasah, similarly, you have a similar sort of background, sort of being born into the movement. tell us how that sort of fact, and as well being, you know, the daughter of one of the most revered warriors for justice in Malcolm X. Just what is that? How has that impacted your path and your life, and how has that brought you here today?
So my father, a lot of people don't realize he was such a young man. He was only in his 20s when the world learned of him. And it was during a time when young people were demonstrating, marching, protesting, basically for very similar demands. And so, you know, that's against police brutality, for quality education, housing, quality lifestyle, etc. And my father came along and said, we demand our human rights as your brother. We demand our human rights ordained by God. And so he introduced a human rights agenda to the civil rights movement, that we don't have to sit around and beg and ask for things, but that we are ordained these things by God, simply being human being. And so he helped us understand that we had an identity, that we had a very rich history, because we didn't know that, right? We had been brainwashed for so long. And by a historically corrupt system. And so fast forward, on Valentine's Day, his home was firebombed. A bomb was thrown into the nursery where my sisters and I slept as babies. And a week later, and that was on Valentine's Day, a week later, my mother witnessed her husband being assassinated. And, you know, I often look back at that and say, you know, it's just so amazing, because she didn't raise us as a bitter person. She never saw herself as a victim. She never gave in to, I can't do this, as an answer for herself, because she understood history. She understood who she was as a woman, who she was as a person of the diaspora, the African diaspora, and who she was as a Muslim. And she raised her 6 daughters with a very solid sense of our identity. And so we grew up with a lot of love. And it was so funny, because when I would go places, people never knew who to expect, not realizing that my father believed in the oneness of God, hence the oneness of man. And that's what he was fighting for. He wasn't just walking around angry for no reason. He had a profound reaction to the systemic injustices, these horrific conditions that we are seeing today, the same conditions that have existed for hundreds of years, right? But we got distracted. And so this is one of the things we want to make sure that our young people don't do today, that we don't become distracted. But for me, growing up and seeing a lot of young people, you know, as a reflection of myself, not understanding their history, not understanding their value, their worth, their morals, etc., it just, you know, I had so much compassion, and, you know, understanding the capacity to see right from wrong, not a black and white issue, right? But it's wrong. You know, we can look on our phones in the middle of the night, in the morning, and see all of these horrendous killings. And so for me, it has been extremely important to make sure that young people understood their value. They knew that they were worthy of self-love, and that they were worthy of a quality education and to participate in the global economy if they choose. And so that's why I've written my books and all of the other things that I do, professor, and so forth.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Steve, welcome. And you are the first African-American mayor of the capital city of South Carolina, Columbia. Tell us about the path that led you to that position, and to you becoming president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and to having a really influential keynote address at the Democratic National Convention last time around. What's been your path? How did you get to where you are in life now?
Thank you, Michael, so much for this opportunity to share this panel with these amazing men and women Very much like everyone else, I'll tell you, God, two incredible parents. If God allowed me to pick my own two parents, I could have picked better than Sam and Maggie Benjamin. Some incredible teachers and mentors who laid a foundation for me. My parents left rural South Carolina, Orangeburg, South Carolina, in the mid '60s as not as immigrants, not as migrants, but as refugees. And it's important that people know that when people left the South, in the old South, it wasn't always a choice. It was a necessity, looking for opportunity for their kids. I was born and raised in Queens, in New York, South Jamaica, Queens, and had a journey like so many of us do, so many of our boys do. The problem is so many of those journeys end before they've even finished puberty. But I had a rough time in high school, suspended twice, had to go to night school to make my way through, and thank God I always did well in standardized tests, and it got me into college because certainly my GPA and my behavior didn't. So I made it through, and I'll tell you, matriculating as a freshman here in Columbia at the University of South Carolina, very early on, I was able to cleave to some of our African-American professors, a handful of them back then, about a half dozen, and some incredible mentors who introduced me to civil rights, the civil rights movement. Fighting against apartheid, fighting to take the Confederate battle flag off our state capitol at the time, where it flew in a position of sovereignty, and took literally almost 25 and 30 years and a whole lot of bloodshed to finally take it off of our state house grounds. But I am the product of literally tens of thousands, millions of men and women who labored in the vineyards from before Robert Smalls on through Chevara's parents and Ilyasah's parents and the incredible work that Charlamagne and all three of these folks are just doing right now. I was able to recognize, because of the guidance of the men and women who invested in me, that I was a link in the long chain of the African seed and the American sun. And I was standing on the shoulders of amazing men and women, so many of whose names will never be they'll never be lionized, and names will never be written in granite or in cast in iron, but they literally given everything for me to have the opportunities to participate as a full citizen in American life. And I was able to learn early on that it was, as soon as I was of age, it was my turn to put my shoulders to service. And I'll tell you, I didn't think about becoming mayor until I had children. And I had my first daughter, and you start thinking about the world in which you're living, the immediate world around you, and wanting to make that city better is what I decided I would run for mayor. And it's been a wonderful ride. The last 10 years, I will tell you this thing, George Washington got a whole lot wrong. The one that he did get right is 2 terms. The third term, y'all, the third term, particularly the things we're dealing with right now, it's an amazing challenge, but it's been a blessing of my life, the professional blessing of my life, and it's been amazing.
I also want to say, Michael, I too was expelled from 2 high schools in South Carolina and graduated in night school as well.
Come on, I did not know that, Charlamagne.
Berkeley High School and Stratford High School, and I graduated from night school. And it was so embarrassing because my mother is an English teacher, and she was an English teacher at Stratford High School.
Charlotte, I will tell you, I told that story for the very first time to my children during my State of the City address 2 years ago, and I realized they hadn't heard the story before. And you should have seen their eyes light up. They thought Daddy got straight A's all through school because I told them that.
Wow.
And and I just want to say that it's important for young people to understand that you just have to push through. And usually, when the more challenges you have, sometimes at a younger age, it gives you such perseverance, such tenacity, and all of those things. And I think for a lot of young people to even know, for instance, that Charlamagne, persevered and went through night school to make sure that he graduated, and then to look at him today. And the same thing with our mayor, and the same thing with my beautiful sister, Chevara, and how much of an honor and privilege it is to share this, what am I going to call it, a platform, or are we going to call it a stage? I don't know what we're going to call it. And thank you, Michael, for moderating our discussion.
Of course, it's my honor.
I just wanted to say, I think that's, sharing truth is so important, especially in Black communities where it's so difficult for us to share truth because that's another layer, right, of oppression when we think about the white gaze. I was that 20-year-old breastfeeding, taking notes in the back of a college classroom. I graduated from college pregnant with my second son. And it was hard. It was really hard working 3 low-wage part-time jobs, sometimes walking to college because I didn't have transportation. And I stand up in corporate spaces and I share that story with corporate executives, right? And when I think about how we are still standing, resilience is key. And there's also a real cost to resilience that we don't talk about often.
That's right.
Right? Yeah.
That's right.
So this is amazing. I am so enjoying this this interaction. I want to dive into some of these questions just to help contextualize kind of where we are right now in this country. It's been a really amazing spring in so many different ways. Amazing, not necessarily in a good way, in a complicated way. These are unprecedented times, at least in my lifetime. When I think about the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and just so many others, and the uprising of protest and around social justice that has inspired. I just wonder, based on your experience, based upon kind of where you come from in life, just what do you make of this spring? And obviously COVID has added something to this mix perhaps, but I just wonder, what do you make of this spring?
I'd be happy to start off. I mean, it's the greatest pandemic since 1918, the greatest economic disruption, GDP down 4.8%. I think the economy contracted about 33% last quarter, first quarter, second quarter. In the greatest social unrest around racism and structural racism and police violence since 1968. You got 1918, 1932, 1968, all wrapped up into a few months with quite frankly, with the worst possible person leading the country that you could possibly have. Obviously, you mentioned COVID-19. COVID-19 had us all, most of us, I should say, sequestered, sheltering in place, and quite frankly, forced to sit down and watch the state-sponsored public execution of a child of God. And that's what it was. We watched a man be murdered, and in normal times, we've gone, we're jet set, and everybody's got their cell phones out, the iPad out. We're not focusing. We all had to sit down and watch this, and I think I will say I think it broke a whole lot of folks' hearts while their lives are being upended economically and as a public health threat, as it was infecting millions of Americans, and I think people just had enough, and America exploded again at the worst possible time under the worst leadership we could possibly have, and as a result, we're dealing with this trifecta. Someone said the other day that dealing with the pandemic and the economic disruption and the incredible social unrest around racism is that it's like your house is on fire and someone walks up and says, "Oh, by the way, your house is on a sinkhole. Your house is sinking too." And someone else walks up and said, "Have you seen that tornado coming down the street?" You get all these things happening at one time, and it's a challenge. I will say that, but for the fact that I know the story of melanated people, and I know the story of the African seed and the American son, I would say it would be impossible to overcome. But I know better, and I know that we can get through this. But we're going to have to really not take for granted some of the wonderful gifts that we have as citizens of this country, and understand that, as Professor Shabbazz was saying earlier, that with these rights, these hard-earned rights, come responsibilities as well, and that's something you learn by experience. We got to get everyone stepping up to make sure that we keep fighting to make this a more perfect union. But it's some difficult times. I'll tell you this as a mayor, with a dysfunctional state government and a dysfunctional federal government, we're in some times right now, brother. We are.
We are in some times, and I think it is extremely important that, you know, especially around this whole Black Lives Matter awareness, right? I think it's important that Black people make sure that they are controlling their narrative, right? That we can't sit back and think that now everything is going to change, because there have been several protests, marches, demonstrations for a very long time, during slavery, after slavery, today, in the 50s, in the 60s. And so, you know, it was awful that here we are at home wondering, are we going to, you know, come on the other side of this pandemic? Is it going to get us? And while wondering, while questioning our own mortality, that we would witness, as the mayor said, this horrible, this just awful execution. I mean, you have one person on his neck, another officer on one lung, the other officer on the other lung, and the other one, you know, watching, you know, aiding and abetting. And so if we don't do anything to ensure that right now, while we have opportunity for change, if we don't do something to ensure that we actually have that change, then that means that we too are aiding and abetting, right? And so it's extremely important, again, I think, that we make sure that our young people understand that they have to be persistent and that they have to control the narrative.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I think if there's ever a time for revolution, this is it. And I really love what you said about controlling the narrative. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. So I've spent, you can imagine what the last 8 weeks has looked like, when every corporation and every small organization and every entrepreneurial business has said, now we need some diversity training because we've seen it now. But the narrative is really important, because as I spend time mostly with white people, because they are the leaders in many of these organizations, this idea that Black rage has surfaced in a way that they've never seen it. And the narrative around what is even the language of riot and rebellion. There's all this conversation, right? That Black people are rioting and they're looting their own communities and neighborhoods, and why are they doing that? And I stop them and I say, you know, let's talk about the language of riot and rebellion. The language of riot is random act of violence. The language of rebellion, right, is political response to historic oppression and structural inequity. So then I pose the question, what do you think we have? And this awareness, and they say, wow, this is rebellion. And, you know, when I think about the rage that we are seeing Black people in corporate spaces exhibit that we have never seen before on LinkedIn, for example, Black leaders, Black directors and senior VPs writing open letters to their CEO saying, I am not okay. I am afraid to be a Black man, not just out in the street, but when I shut my door and take my jacket off in my office, I am terrified about what's going to happen to me here. And we've never seen anything like that. And so I do think there is also this empowerment that is happening in our Black community, especially in corporate spaces where you've never seen Black people raise their voices and raise their fist in the way that we see it.
And that we have to understand that we are fighting against the corruption. So while people thought that Malcolm, you know, was advocating something that he wasn't, right? My father was a young man. His parents instilled specific values in him. His father was lynched. His father was the president of the Milwaukee chapter of the Garvey movement that commanded millions of followers. So he instilled specific values in his children. His mother was the national recording secretary who let her son understand, and his siblings, that they were global citizens. They knew they had a history. So they instilled these specific values in Malcolm. Not that story that Malcolm was just this deviant who went to jail and miraculously became. He became because his parents were involved in his life, and they instilled specific values that countered Jim Crow, slavery, corruption, criminalization, all of these things. And I think what's happening today is we're now seeing the corruption. We're seeing, the lies, so it's not that we're just naturally angry. We're angry because you have criminalized us for so long. Look at these atrocious acts that happened in history. And so the good thing is that our young people, this generation of young people, realize that those who have been in power for a very long time have misused their power. And we believe in our humanity. And thank God for this young generation who is stepping forward, and their parents who is, providing the support, and the importance of this intergenerational dialogue. Because we have a lot of young people who are now saying, they're realizing the history. They're realizing that we weren't just enslaved because we were lazy people, right? But that we were indigenous, thriving people here already before Columbus. We were thriving, building pyramids and erecting monuments and all kinds of things on the continent, and realizing that we were all around the world, that we weren't just dropped off as slaves, but that we were enslaved by a very corrupt system, a system that was designed to do the things that they've done for a long time. And thank God now we're maturing, and we're seeing that these things are no longer acceptable. And we have the capacity to see that it's not a black and white issue, it's an issue of right and wrong. And that we have the capacity to recognize that and do something about it. We just have to make sure that our young people don't stop.
No, I agree. I have to ask, this came actually from the audience, but it's a perfect question. We've all heard this question: is this a moment or is this a movement? Mm-hmm. I wonder what thoughts you have about this.
I think it has to be a movement. I mean, I think that's consistent with both our colleagues have said, and hopefully somebody's trying to get Charlamagne back in. I'm not sure how you get him back in. It's got to be a movement, and I think that's where I have two teenagers in my house, two young female superstars, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old who are thoroughly engaged in this. And my wife is the chief criminal judge here in our circuit, and the chief of the state grand jury, and running to be the first black woman on a court of appeals here in South Carolina. So they know exactly who they are and whose they are, and the way in which they fit into this world. I do not hesitate to say that these two young women are so much brighter and much more advanced than I was at their age. It's not even close. Not even close. It's our job to teach them and help them accelerate as much as possible some of the things you only learn from experience. Experience is the very best teacher. The challenge is it's a painful teacher. So how do we make sure that we open up a really meaningful dialogue with some of these dynamic young leaders that are out there, some who are doing amazing work, and help guide them in a way that helps them accelerate their development and the impact, because this does have to become a movement. How do you turn all this pain and this passion into real progress? Recognizing that we are talking about structural racism. We're not talking about a system of government that's not working for us. We're talking about at times a system of government that was designed not to work for us. I mean, you talk about enslavement. I mean, it's so hard to even grasp the idea of human chattel slavery. I was sitting with my 13-year-old now, this is maybe almost 3 years ago, and she begins to tell me that there were no slaves. I said, well, what do you mean there's no slaves? She said, our people may have been enslaved, but they were not slaves. She said, because no man can own another child of God. Was her response. Right. Yeah, I just put down my fork, and so they get it. They get it. It's our job to really help them turn all this into real progress that allows us to begin to deconstruct some of the systems of government, local level, state level, the national level, recognizing that yes, still in this world in which we live, political power is borrowed power. That wealth and wealth creation and generational wealth is a way in which you can really make some changes. So I'm enjoying, as Chevara said, I'm enjoying watching these dialogues on LinkedIn and people, just ringing the bell left and right. But we're going to have to guide those discussions and guide that capital in a way that really helps mitigate this incredible gap that we're seeing, these wealth gaps that we talked about a little bit before. And it's important to note that even before the coronavirus hit America and we started shutting down, and then obviously with this rapid series of deaths, we saw murders of these beautiful men and women. America was broken long before that. We had major challenges long before that. So we're going to have to really start thinking about ways in which we really give people a legitimate and real opportunity to participate in the largesse of what is still the wealthiest democratic nation in the history of the world. Those ladders that we always talked about are just not there. And we've got to find ways to rebuild it in a way that allows people to participate in ways in which they can work to continue changing their communities. I'll say this last thing, and I'll be quiet. I see Charlotte's back. The reality is that most of these solutions, while many of them will not be government solutions. In order to get things done, it's going to require an intergovernmental, intersectoral approach. It's public, it's private, it's philanthropic, it's individuals stepping up and making sure that we need to do what we're supposed to do. Because the reality is that if you, just one minor point, if you're going to change law enforcement or public safety in the community, the answer is never to send a stranger with a gun to solve a problem. That's not the answer. So we're not talking about reinventing policing. We're talking about how do we reimagine safer communities in different ways in which you can do it. And some people want to put in the bumper sticker and defund the police, or whatever that happens to be. But the reality is we're talking about how we completely reimagine, how do we make sure that our communities are safe. And we all know that that's not something the cops can do. That's something that we all have to make sure that we can do, while at the very same time demanding that there's no state-sponsored violence oppressing people of color across the country. So it's a larger dialogue, and I'm done.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I love the word reimagine. In my mind, if there was ever a time to reimagine every single system that we have, right? None of them, I won't say they haven't been working, because they have been working. They were designed to work this way: white supremacy, structural racism, right? But if we are reimagining, for example, education, which hasn't worked for a very long time for most of us, if we are reimagining healthcare, if we are reimagining our prison industrial complex, I mean, this is the time to do that. The structures, to your point, Michael, that you made before, they are right before us exploding. It's all imploding before us. And so here is, this idea that we are going to go back. People who are saying, well, I can't wait until it gets back to, we are not going back to the normal is what got us here, right? So we are here. And so what does it look like for us to not just reimagine our communities, but these systems? And I do think for the first time in a long time, the conversation around systems is happening too. I spend a lot of time in corporate spaces, and most people, usually on a base level, are talking about interpersonal racism. And so, I didn't call someone the N-word. I did not intentionally not put someone in a candidate pool. And now they're actually having conversations about the systems, because I go in, I'm meeting with corporate leaders, and I'm asking them, are you willing to interrogate your own organizational complicity in either upholding or creating this system of inequity? And that's not a conversation that's ever been had in corporate spaces before.
Absolutely. I want to apologize because there was a real bad storm here in Jersey yesterday, and it's got the Wi-Fi all messed up. So I feel like I'm back home in South Carolina on a dirt road.
We appreciate that you're back.
Yes.
We appreciate that you're back.
But Michael, to your question, you asked the question, you said, that's the other thing that happened. I was on the general audience link wondering why I couldn't see myself, but I was listening. But you said, is this a movement or a moment?
Yes.
And I think that when you're Black in America, the fight against white supremacy is never a moment. It's a constant battle. Trying to dismantle systemic racism is never a moment. It's a constant battle. Now, I think sometimes we can get a little comfortable because sometimes we get tired and we like, oh, maybe this is the best that it's going to get. But I think what we saw with George Floyd, the fact that, you know, God literally had everybody sitting still. You know, God says, be still and know that I am God. When that pandemic was at its height, everybody was at home. And I'm the type of person, I try to avoid those videos because a lot of times when I see people sharing those videos online, I ask myself, I hope you're not sharing that for me, because I know what my people face in the street. So to me, we're just sharing trauma with each other. Now, if you're trying to get the attention of these white people who act like they don't know, don't show, or don't give a damn about what's going on in the Black community, like Doughboy said in Boys in the Hood, if we're trying to get their attention, cool. What that George Floyd video did was it got their attention, and it got the world's attention. And I think it made Black people say, wait, hold up. If in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, you know, if we not all free, then nobody's free. And I think it finally made America say, I think we really do have a problem. I think this systemic racism, this white supremacy thing these Black folks keep talking about is a real issue. And so now it's like if you ignore it, then you're clearly picking a side. If you're silent about it, then you're clearly picking a side. So when you see all of these corporations and all of these white people stepping up saying, hey, I want to do what's right, it's only because they know they can't ignore the problem anymore, because ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away.
Right, and that's the reason why we have to make sure that we are steadfast and focused, that we are strategic, and that we identify what goals do we want to accomplish. And we have a checklist, and we do not stop until those goals are accomplished, because we know what it is to be distracted, right? We think, oh, we're doing better. Racism is over. But we have to make sure that we have our checklist and that we are strategic. One of in the Malcolm X film, many people saw how my father had all of these members outside of this hospital because one of the young brothers had been beaten so badly and was not given medical attention, but instead was brought was being taken to a prison. And they demanded that he was brought to the hospital, and they didn't leave until he had medical attention. And so how did my father get all of those people out there at a drop of a dime? Two people were responsible for contacting one person was responsible for contacting two people. So we have to have strategies on how we're going to accomplish our goals and make sure that other people understand what our strategies and our goals are. And so that's one of the things that I'm really grateful for with you, Charlamagne, and I know Angela Rye, being strategic and making sure people are on the same playing field, that we are informed and that we understand what our goals are, because we have to control the narrative. And the only way it's going to end is when we do that ourselves. Again, my father said only a fool is going to sit back and allow his enemy to teach his children. And we know the things that have already happened. And to think that people aren't capable of continuing to do these horrible, horrific, inhumane acts would be quite naive of us.
And what saddens me is we're not fighting any new problems.
Right.
Like none of these problems are new. All of these underlying conditions that coronavirus allegedly exposed, they've been here.
Well, and that's what I want to really explore now, because, you know, we've seen this explosion of protests and frankly, around the world. There were people in Europe, you know, with Black Lives Matter, you know, signs and, you know, here we have seen the notion of Black Lives Matter has become maybe more palatable. We've seen some Confederate symbols come down here in my hometown of Charleston. I never thought I would see, you know, some of the stuff occur, you know, the John C. Calhoun, statue come down. So, but what does that mean? Are we really has the African American community made sort of gains in social justice? Is this window dressing? What do you think about where we are now at this point?
I think that our young people saw an African American president. something that we never expected to see. And just seeing that, especially for someone really young, was empowering and gave them lots of hope, right? That we have learned about the truth of our identity. We learned that we have history. Like the mayor said, his daughter said, they are not slaves. They were enslaved human beings. So you have to look at who did such a thing. And so becoming more aware, more educated, this generation, you know I saw a couple of signs where they said, we are not our ancestors. We are not going to allow you to disparage our ancestors nor us. So I think it's a new generation.
I hate those. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Charlamagne.
No, I hate those "we are not our ancestors" signs. I think those are so disrespectful because I think our ancestors were way more gangster and way more focused, and they stayed the course because they literally had nothing else to do but fight for their civil liberties. I really think those signs are super disrespectful. But
I hear that a lot, but I do believe that they meant that we are going to fight you head on. And we are going to protect our ancestors' memory, legacy.
I did have a great debate with a young protester who's wearing a shirt that said my grandmother marched so I wouldn't have to, and I was thinking, why would you think that? Quite frankly, I mean, this is a perpetual engagement, perpetual struggle. It ought not be. But we ought not go into this believing that the battles were fought in the 1960s and apparently, it wrap things up. Michael, to your question, I do believe that it's important. I fought a battle here and continue to fight. And although we were where the first secession convention was held before it moved to Charleston, and we were state capital, we don't have a significant number of Confederate monuments here. All of them are on the State House grounds, those 16 acres. And when I was asked that question several years ago by Chris Matthews, I actually raised the story of J. Marion Sims, who was not a Confederate soldier, but he's known more popularly as a father of modern obstetrics and gynecology, who practiced his craft on primarily 3 enslaved women, Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy, and African American children in the mid to late 19th century, even after the advent of anesthesia, but did not use them with them. He's a modern day butcher. So when I tell people, when I focus on the State House grounds, literally just about 1,000 feet away from me, I'm focused on Sims much more than I am on anything else up there because I deem him a butcher. I do believe it's important to cross those thresholds we should have crossed a long time ago. So the proper contextualization of these historic figures and at very least tell them the whole story. But at most, those statues and those objects, most of which were erected, I might add, in the 20th century, long after the Civil War was over, to deify these men who ought not be deified. I think those are important moments, but I don't think any of us should confuse that with some level of victory. It's a step in the process. We're at a point right now where I think a lot of folks are feeling, including some folks who are allies and however you might characterize them over the course of history, where a lot of people are finally feeling that the future is indeed subjective, that there are a number of possible futures here. And if in fact we were able to put the sweat, equity, and the work in, the real work in, we can really fundamentally change the futures of so many people who up until now have been completely shut out of American society in any meaningful way.
I think all of you made some really, really great points. And I was thinking, Mayor Benjamin, what you were just talking about with Sims, and Charlamagne, you were talking about how none of this is new, right? I mean, we still had a eugenics movement until the mid-1970s in this nation, North Carolina, led by some of the leaders in our world, right? Thinking about Rockefellers, thinking about families that had built fortunes on the backs of Black people. And Michael, to your question, symbolism is important, right? We've seen Aunt Jemima walk right off of that pancake box. We have seen the Confederate flag come down from a state and from NASCAR. We have seen corporations say we're no longer going to use the language of slave and master or master bedroom. But structural change, the point that my sister made, if we don't have sound strategy that's going to impact policy and practice within these organizations and within these systems, the symbolism is important because representation absolutely does matter. Like President Obama in the White House, like being able to go to a state capitol and not see the blood-stained flag fluttering in front of you. But at the end of the day, if we don't have strategy so that we can impact policy and practice within the organizations and the systems, it's dead symbolism.
I agree. It's dead symbolism. I care about systemic change. I want to see legislation. I want to see reparations. I want to see real atonement for what this country did to my people. You know, yes, the symbolism is great, but we need real systemic change.
You know,
Charlamagne, and are we getting that? I mean, are we heading in that direction? You know, at this moment, we've seen some maybe superficial actions with statues coming down and the like, but are we moving in the direction of gaining real social change, do you believe?
Well, you know what? I'm going to say something about reparations. About a year and a half ago, I started having conversations, or beginning to try to have conversations with CEOs about corporate reparations. And they just had this blank look. Now they're picking up the phone and they're calling me back and they're asking, Chevara, that conversation you were trying to have with me last year, I was having a conversation with a CEO of a bank recently, a bank that discovered that they were built on the slave trade. It's new news to the senior leadership. New news to the senior leadership. So I went back to the CEO and I asked him, I said, so you know that your institution was built on the backs of enslaved people. You also know that you have racism, systemic racism, white supremacy within the organization because your data shows you that there's huge inequity in pay, in hiring and practice. I said, what might it look like? And I don't know what you call it. White folks are going to get really mad because they're going to say, wait a minute, they getting a bonus because they Black? And the answer is absolutely they are.
Yes.
I said, so what would it look like to bring in, I said, you know, you need an economist, you need a historian, but create a formula so that as Black people are coming in, you are doing something to dismantle the wage inequity. And he looked and he said, you know what? That's something I think we could explore. He wouldn't have that conversation last year. Frankly, I think that is a practice that a lot of corporations should be thinking about. What would it look like, right, to have corporate reparations as it relates to wages, salaries for Black people who we know have been disenfranchised for centuries. And I think that's a conversation that these organizations are willing to have now. And to your point, Ilyasah, that's the conversation where if we're organized and all of us go in and you pick the top 100 corporations and you say, here's the strategy, here's the formula, it would change everything for us when we think about what wage earning looks like in the United States.
You're absolutely right. That's why I love Robert Smith's 2% plan that he's doing, where he's telling these corporations to give up 2% of their net income every year for the next 10 years to Black banks. I think that's genius. But to your point, like if you go in there with an actual plan, an actual agenda, then they will respond. And it's not bonus pay, by the way. It's back pay.
It's back pay, yeah. And it's Black pay, right? It's
Black pay.
It's Black pay.
That's right.
You know, I even tell people in sessions, you know how sometimes white people will say, hey, can I get a Black perspective on that? I tell in these sessions, I'll say, listen, somebody asks you for a Black perspective, you better give them your Venmo. I said, you tell them this Black perspective in this meeting, it's going to cost you, right?
That's right.
It's important, Chevara. You can't manage what you can't measure. And
That's
I think
right.
actually having some real options on the table. You know, the fact I'm in the building of the only Black-owned bank in South Carolina, Optus Bank, and to think that there are 21 still. I think we're about to lose one Black-owned banks in this country, and none of them have over $1 billion in assets. And those are things that we can fundamentally change through ideas like Robert Smith and some other really cool ideas floating around there. But if you can't really put it in a package that you can manage and track and actually hold people accountable. I mean, we've seen, I mean, in your industry, Charlotte, we've seen so many different ideas from Netflix, so much money flying around right now. And we've seen them over the years with CRA commitments from banks and others who make some commitments that they never live up to. You know, so being able to adequately track them. Had a great conversation with Derek Johnson of the NAACP just yesterday on some different ways in which we can actually actively track these commitments, see if people are truing up to these commitments, and then also looking at even things like political giving. You know, they're you know that, this is not meant to be political, Michael. I'm not gonna make it political, but Steve King just lost his primary in Iowa. A virulent racist and anti-Semite, and anything else you could possibly think of. You know, who the heck was giving him money all these years? You know, Jim Jordan from Ohio, just like Marsha Fudge. You know, let me tell you what, if you're giving Jim Jordan money to get up there and act the fool the way that he does, but you're not contributing to Marsha Fudge, there's an issue there. So beginning to track these political contributions, and then being able to hold donors and corporations accountable. If you're giving this person money who's actively engaged in attempting to oppress people, to deny them of their rights to the ballot, to deny them the right to the franchise or their full participation in American society, then we're gonna put you on blast. I'm gonna get Charlamagne on Twitter.
That's what I'm talking about.
Blow you up. I'm gonna get Black Twitter to blow you up. You know, I mean, but being able to effectively track those things in a way and stay on top of people, to demand some type of real accountability that we've not necessarily had in the past.
That's right. And even with our educational curriculum, you know, that's one of the things. I'm so glad that I grew up. My mother made sure that we had someone who would come to our house Wednesdays and Thursdays and teach us. I am so grateful for it. And, you know, if we, in American history, for example, understood that the Tulsa massacre, the Rosewood massacre were just as American as the Boston Tea Party, then we would understand the necessity for reparations. If we understood that all of our art from the Empire of Benin and Africa, all across the place, look at these pyramids that are absolutely empty. All of this art that has been looted and sits in other people's museums where they make a wealth of money. If we understood all of these things, we would understand why there are such complexities of the continent. So it's important, especially, that the educational curriculum is inclusive of historical facts. And the only way it's going to be inclusive of historical facts is by us taking responsibility and being very strategic and very consistent until our goal and our jobs are complete. And that was the beauty of my father.
I need to ask a question, shift it a little bit. It seems like allies have been a greater part of this particular movement or moment, however one chooses to look at it, than in the past. Certainly, as I mentioned, there were white folks all throughout Europe, all around the world, who were, you know, raising Black Lives Matter signs. I wonder what your thoughts are about sort of the appropriate role of allies and what the relationship should be, and how to enhance sort of Black-white relationships to move social justice forward.
One of the ladies go first.
So I'll take that one since I've got the white mama, right? So what I will say is I want to share something. This is a statement. It is obvious from the actions of citizens that they intend to control their own lives and communities, even if it means burning and taking what they think should be theirs. And if the same old structures rise again, they will be burned again. Several nights ago on television, a businessman from 7th Street said that his store was looted. Then he put steel doors on it, and it was looted again. That shows the determination of the people to have what they consider to be rightfully theirs. Persons don't intentionally burn down that which they own or find satisfactory, only that which they can no longer tolerate. That was written by my mother, April 1968, the week that Dr. King was assassinated, when she's a 76-year-old white Jewish woman right now. She and a rabbi, who's 87, and this brother's so bad, y'all, he was dressed as the Statue of Liberty last September, blocking an ICE detention center with 100 other Jewish people. But my mom and Rabbi Waskow organized 100 white and Jewish people in Washington for an entire week right after King was assassinated. They were in DC. They sent white physicians into the streets to pick up Black bodies that had been beaten. And they discovered chronic illness like diabetes, which we know, right, for centuries has been in our communities. They sent white attorneys into the jail to demand a lowering of bail. 8,000 people had been arrested for disobeying a 4 p.m. curfew. White mothers and nurses took in Black babies and children because parents had been either lost or arrested in the fray. They did that for an entire week, and then they issued this radical ass statement, probably the most radical statement I've ever heard from white people, demanding that the government give Black people policing over themselves. They said for 300 years, America has demanded that Blacks be nonviolent, even if whites are violent. Now it is time for us to repay that historic debt. She was 24 years old. So, you know, I walk into corporate spaces and I have to temper myself because my expectation about who and what white people should be doing is really high. And, you know, when I think about my relationship with my mother, I have always intimately loved a white person. And I don't say that because I get a gold star for it, but most Black people don't say that because America, we can't say that, right? And so when I think about, my mom told me when I was 6, she thought that there would be a race war. She told me I was a Black girl. I've always only wanted to be a Black girl and a Black woman because of my white mother. And she said, girls, I believe there's going to be a race war, and you will rise up as Black women and you will kill me, and I am willing to die for your Black liberation and freedom.
Wow.
Now, I'm not suggesting that all the white allies out there, especially the ones who might be listening to us now, I'm not suggesting you lay your white body down for my Black liberation, but I do expect you to move in a way that is really, really radical. And, you know, I get really emotional about this, and it's because the complicit silence of white people. Remember Dr. King said, we'll have to repent in this world and next, not only for the vitriolic words of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people, the white folks who sit around and say, but I'm a good white person and I mean well, and I have Black friends. And I think that allyship really means it's solidarity, right? Which is, I think, a stronger word. It's also co-conspirator. I mean, I need white people to be a co-conspirator with me. I don't necessarily need them to be an allyship for, but what does solidarity with look like for Black people?
What other thoughts about this issue of allies, and anyone else?
I think, you know, the answer for me is simple. It's just like, I want you to simply use your privilege to combat prejudice. That's it. You know, you use the power that you have here in America to combat prejudice. You know, when I saw, when I was watching Bill Clinton give the eulogy at John Lewis's funeral, and he said that, you know, the civil rights movement went a little too Stokely, you know, but John Lewis prevailed. I'm like, what does that even mean? You needed a Stokely and you needed a John Lewis. And I'm sitting there watching that. Like, that's the epitome of privilege. That's privilege getting in the way. Because the truth to the matter is, if white people were treating Black people as human beings and giving us what we were promised in this country to begin with, which is freedom, liberty, equality, and justice for all, there wouldn't even have been a need for a civil rights movement. So all I simply ask from white people is use your privilege to combat prejudice. Just simply treat me the way that you want to be treated. We learned this golden rule in high school, but nobody follows it but Black people.
That's right. And so when we're talking about aiding and abetting, as those 3 officers did, if white people do nothing, they're aiding and abetting, because we've all seen why we're saying Black Lives Matter. We see the injustice, we see the corruption. We are aware now. And so there is no going back. And if you turn your back, what does that say about you and your value system?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting to your point, Charlamagne. You know, white supremacy suggests that the only road is passivity, right? Mm-hmm. And so when this divide and conquer, but what Stokely said in 1966, he was at the University of Berkeley, and he said to those students, white people, you need to do the work, where racism basically is manifest in white communities. I created a campaign a couple of years ago called White and Woke. It was right after Philando Castile was murdered. And it was with that idea that white people needed to do the work with other white people. The burden, this emotional burden that we have as Black people to educate white people couldn't fall on us any longer. And so it was an entire campaign for white people to educate other white people to do exactly that, Charlamagne, to recognize where they hold privilege, their societal privilege, their positional power, and to create systemic change. So yeah, completely agree with that.
Yeah, powerful. Let's switch. Let's switch and talk about young people and their role in this movement. I went to a protest at the sort of the base of the Calhoun Monument before it came down, obviously, and it was a Black Lives Matter. It was driven by sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that day, at least, it was led almost exclusively by young Black women who were out front, who were putting themselves, their bodies on the line, their voices out, leading the protest. And, we've seen that sort of consistently. Let's talk about young people and young Black women in terms of their leadership of all this.
I've been excited by, I always joke and say, when I was in college, I used to, dream of someday living in a house full of women. I actually got my dream. I have three amazingly talented women who run my house, and every protest before the pandemic, that if it was decrying gun violence and trying to get some accountability around the First Amendment, my girls didn't give me an option as to whether or not they were going to participate. They told me they're going. So they're going to Uber there, or I was going to take them. And so they've been very active in making sure that their rights as citizens here are manifest. I have come across some incredibly talented and gifted young people who are doing an amazing job articulating their demands. Some are off the races, doing their own thing. Others need a little bit more guidance. If in fact you want to help guide them towards really getting the changes that we're all talking about. But I've been impressed. Someone told me several weeks ago, this is a white person said it was time for him it was time to ponder and not to pander. He needed time to be able to think and understand and just listen. The one challenge that I know that we have, not just in this community, I think it's everywhere, is that so many of our young people, all of us are about old enough where you could turn on the news, at night, and you got three older middle-aged white men telling you what's happening all around the world. And then you have Black radio that in whatever community you were in. For me, it was KISS or WBL. That's what it happened to be. And then that's pretty much about 5-6 places you got your news from. And now, literally, there's some folks here with Facebook pages that get more information to the community than some of our traditional networks do it all. So you have so many different people communicating on different platforms. Some legitimate platforms, some not legitimate platforms, some that purely look to monetize conflict, and others that just wish to push an agenda. But you wind up having these conversations where people are talking over each other, not talking to each other. And what I've found is that the very best thing is just be not omnipresent, but ever present, going straight to young people, asking questions, and then shutting up and saying, tell me your stories. Help me understand why are you here. Help me understand what got you here, and then where you're trying to get to, and just trying to drive that energy that hopefully gets them someplace by the time they're 30, to where I got to age 50. Accelerate that development, because we need them actively involved in helping drive this discussion right now. I'm encouraged by what I see.
You have thoughts about young people?
First of all, Black women have always led, right? We have always led. I think about the book Hands on the Freedom Plow. It's a whole book of the women of SNCC, whose voices weren't necessarily uplifted, but the work that they did. And I think about when my father was down in Birmingham in 1963, no one thought it was a good idea to put children on the front lines. But those children were 6 and 9 and 12, and thousands of them, right, were arrested. And there's a documentary. It's a documentary about that time. It's I can't think of it's slipping my mind now. But what he talks about in the documentary is that the girls, the little Black girls, were the ones who were actually leading. And he kind of jokingly says the football teams came because the girls were already leading, but the girls were the ones, you know, jumping out of the school windows and organizing and on the front lines. And so we have always had movements led by young people. And I am encouraged too. I live in South Florida, and the young people who are organizing here, the protests, we had a protest just a couple of months ago. It went south, and some police were violent, but they were young Black people from the local Black Lives Matter movement and some other movements that were similar to Black Lives Movement. And they have been the ones who have been guiding the work. They have been, to your point, Ilyasah, they have been the ones who've been strategizing and really creating sound structure for policy movement. So I am very deeply, deeply encouraged about what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I'm not just encouraged, I'm inspired. Yeah, I truly believe that Black women are going to absolutely lead us into the next, you know, level of whatever this country is going to be. Like the best version of this country, everything that is promised us, it's only going to happen through the leadership of Black women and women of color. And, you know, like Steve, I have 4 Black women running my house, my wife and 3 daughters. And, you know, I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'm inspired because maybe like a month or two ago, one of the things that recently inspired me, about a month or two ago, actually, Mayor Tecklenburg reached out to me from Charleston. This was right after they were looting downtown, and, you know, they kind of, you know, got a little rowdy downtown, and he just felt like he didn't know what to do. And I'm like, well, first of all, you need to reach out to some of the young people in Charleston, South Carolina. You need to reach out to some of the young grassroots activists. So I reached out to one of my good friends, a sister by the name of Chris Kalin, who does radio down there. And then, you know, she put us all on this Zoom call with, and I want to say their names, Tamika Gatson and Courtney Hicks and Candace Livingston. When I say these sisters were brilliant, these sisters were brilliant. I mean, they knew every single piece of legislation that was happening in Charleston. They was telling the mayor why the Calhoun statue needs to come down, and he was telling us about this law that of why I couldn't come down, because it's on
the Heritage Act.
Heritage Act. And man, Tamika said something so brilliant. Tamika said, "White political power makes things happen." She said, "I've seen white political will." She said, "I've seen white political will make things happen. So use your white political will to make some things happen." And some things happened. So those sisters are brilliant. So yes, I'm encouraged and inspired.
Yep.
But, you know, one of my books that I wrote, Betty Before X, I was really happy to discover, you know, my mother's childhood. And, you know, she grew up in the African Methodist Episcopalian Church with Reverend Peck, who was a very famous reverend in the 1940s. Paul Robeson came. Many Black activists came to this church. And they, you know, I discovered when they went out and marched and protest that they put on their Sunday's best, right? That it was a time of segregation where they were really integral. You know, the church played such an integral role in the planning, the organizing, the strategizing, and that the wives were outraged that their husbands and children could not get jobs in the meatpacking industry, which was a multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar industry. And so they marched, they protested, they organized amongst themselves until finally the Detroit Housewives became a national organization of women who broke the meatpacking industry and also made sure that the stores where they were buying sold products that were made by Black people. And so a lot of this information today is not even known. And so again, it speaks to the importance of we adults making sure that our young people understand their heritage, their history, because it goes to show all of the things that we must continue to do and control that narrative. Because a lot of people don't know about the Detroit Housewives League. And it is because of this organization that we were allowed, for all people, Black people around the entire country, to participate in this meatpacking industry.
And history gives something for these kids to aspire to. Because I tell the youth all the time, there is nothing that we're discussing that hasn't already happened at some point in Black history. Like, they think that the idea of Black Wall Street is a foreign concept. Like, you're talking about Wakanda as if those Black communities didn't already exist in our country, you know, decades ago. So I just think, you know, when they know the history, not only of, you know, what we're up against in this country, but what we've already done in this country, it just gives them greater heights to aspire to.
Right, right. And also understanding the indigenous people who were here looked a lot like them themselves.
Yeah.
When you think about the Olmecs and the Mayans, and you see those big, gigantic heads, and you see these really full lips, 7,000 years old, 5,000-year-old history. And you know, just understanding our history and how it was just taken and you know.
Yeah. This is such a great conversation. We're heading toward the close, and I want to just begin to sort of wrap up a little bit. But I have some sort of a speed round question for each of you. I'm gonna start with you, Charlamagne. Some folks in the Black community are giving you a little bit of heat about your criticism of Vice President Biden, suggesting that perhaps you are encouraging Black folks to not vote. I just wonder how you think about that. I thought you've been incredibly articulate in your, and I don't mean that obviously in the way that Black people are often said to be articulate, but just thoughtful, I guess is a better word. But I wonder just how you respond to that critique.
I would tell them to listen to Queen Shabazz's father's speech, The Ballot and the Bullet. And I think that, you know, we have been in a position as Black people in America for so long that we don't demand anything for our vote whatsoever. And when we talk about, you know, all of these underlying conditions that coronavirus has exposed, one of those reasons that has happened is because we have not exercised our power the way we should whenever we get these people in these positions. Like, you know, democracy works when we keep our foot on these politicians' necks. And truth be told, when I look at somebody like Joe Biden, I've already said he needs to hurry up and pick his Black woman running mate, because I'm voting for her. Mm-hmm. I'm not voting for him. I'm not voting for him. You know, I've seen 40 years of his legislation and his policies in the Senate, from the 86 mandatory minimum sentencing to the 88 crack laws to the 94 crime bill. He's devastated Black communities and Black families and has not apologized or showed a bit of remorse for it. He put his foot in his mouth today saying that Black people aren't as diverse as Latino voters. Like, he just thinks that we're just this monolithic group of people that don't really want anything in exchange for our vote except for a pat on the back and a visit to the White House. And personally, I'm sick of it. So if people think that I'm somebody that's telling folks, hey man, don't go out and vote, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm telling you, Joe Biden, is that if you want to win in 2020, what you need to do is get those people who voted in 2012 but didn't show up in 2016, that 4.4 million people who a third of them were Black, that didn't show up in 2016, they're not going to show up in 2020 either if you don't make some real policy commitments and start leaning into Blackness in a real way. Because how many times are we going to save, you know, these Democrats' political lives and not get anything in return? Like, that's ridiculous to me. Simple as that. So no, the only person that's leading a boycott of Black voters in 2020 is Joe Biden. He's doing a damn good job of making sure Black people don't show up for him in November.
But we know we're going to make sure that Trump is not going to be our president.
Yeah, thank you.
Listen, I'm a fight. Like I said, I'm voting for his Black woman vice president. I will go out there and campaign for Senator Harris or Susan Rice, whoever it may be. I'm going to go out there and campaign for her in the Senate seats, because I want to flip the Senate. I want Jamie Harrison to win South Carolina.
Yeah.
All right.
So I want to ask a joint question for Chevara and Ilyasah. And Chevara, you've talked a little bit about your mother. but for both of you, you know, people know more about your fathers than your mothers. And I just wonder what you can share with us about your mothers and about their influence on your life and just what they have taught you. Just share a little bit about your mothers, since we know much more about your fathers.
You want to? Well, I think I said, I opened up. I love my mother so much. I'm so grateful that she showed me what love is. She showed me what trust is. I'm so grateful for that. There wasn't much that I ever asked my mother where she said no, you know, and it's a little surprising, but she also said there's nothing wrong with pampering your child with love and attention. And my mother did that. And I'm so grateful for it because, you know, again, what it does is I have self-love, which means I have love for people who I see you as a reflection of me. And I know that I'm a reflection of you. And because I love myself, then it makes me love you without even knowing you. However, of course, you know, when things get rough and, you know, people aren't worthy, you kind of keep moving. But I'm grateful that my mother showed me what love is. And I realized when I wrote her young story, what my father got in his wife and why he chose my mother to be his wife, the compassion, the love, the caring, and the brilliance, you know. And so I'm so grateful that I had, my mother truly was my best friend, and that she was also my role model, my leader, you know, and I'm just grateful for that. And I share her story a lot because I think it's important for young people, again, to understand that my mother never accepted, no, I can't, as an answer for herself. And she was able to raise 6 girls. And I can't tell you all the things, I can't tell you all the good things, all the things that she did in raising us. She was absolutely beautiful woman, inside and out. And Nina Simone's daughter, Lisa Simone, who's one of my best friends, she lived with us. And as if 6 daughters weren't enough, my mother, 1 daughter, you know, so it's just so much of a model that I'm so grateful, Chevara, in having in my mother.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Chevara?
Thank you. I felt that. Thank you for that.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, it's interesting. I'm working on this book, and one of the chapters is about white humility. You know, Robin DiAngelo has that book about white fragility. I think what's needed is white humility. And I think about my mom. She is so extraordinary. She was willing to give up her own family. Her parents disowned her when I was born because I was Black. And we moved to Memphis. I was born in DC. We moved to Memphis when I was about 5. And we were living with some Black Panthers. And the police came one day and they surrounded the house. They were in SWAT gear and there were helicopters, and they had assault weapons. And my mom took me and my sister and she put us under a bed, under a mattress to keep us safe. And it wasn't until I was in college years later and I saw the documentary about the bombing of Osage Avenue, and I realized what could have happened to us in that house. It would have been exactly like what happened in Philadelphia to the MOVE group, right? And
a lot of people don't know what happened. You might want to share.
Oh, sure. The time that our government decided to bomb an entire group of people, they were Black liberation. They were a Black liberation family who believed in just the power of Blackness. They were not violent. And our government burned down. Like 60-something people were killed. There were children who were killed. There are people who are still incarcerated. Thank you for that, Ilyasah. And I remember watching it. I was maybe 18, 19, and I had to walk out of the classroom because I was so triggered that could have been my experience. We left that frying pan and went into a pot and lived next door to, we grew up in abject poverty, and we were living in a 4-room duplex. And our next door neighbor, Mr. Jack, used to sit on his porch with a double-barreled shotgun. And my sister tells this story in an essay that she wrote when she was applying for law school at Yale and Stanford and Harvard. I told you it was probably the most interesting essay they got that year. But she talks about Mr. Jack pulling up this double-barrel shotgun and calling us racial epithets. And what my mother said about that was, you know, girls, Mr. Jack is sitting on that porch, mired in racism and hatred and bigotry. And until he decides to fundamentally change, that is his problem. And I remember thinking with my 6-year-old self, if he pulls that trigger, It seems like it's our problem because our little bodies, our little Black bodies are going to be splattered. But what she was talking about, right, was this internal interrogation about whiteness. She understood whiteness as supremacy. And the biggest example of humility, when I was 3, we were living in Baltimore in a 3-story house. We were renting it for $1 from the Catholic church next door. And one night, a group of 6 Black women surrounded my mother, and they screamed at her, and they yelled at her, and they berated her into the wee hours of the morning. And what they said was, you cannot possibly raise Chevara. You can't teach her her history. You can't raise her to be a Black girl. You can't keep her safe. And my mom said she sat there with tears streaming down her face, and she listened because she wondered if what they said could possibly be true. And what I remember is that long before multiculturalism became mainstream, she would take Black and brown and sienna Crayola crayons, and she would color in people in our children's books that we got from the local library. So we saw ourselves reflected everywhere around us. We attended the only all-Black Girl Scout troop, 144 in Memphis, Tennessee. She made sure that we attended a Black church, even though the Black people in that church didn't recognize her, didn't speak to her. She made sure that we went to an elementary school that had a Black principal. She made sure that we knew we were Black girls. And you know, that level of humility has been so instrumental and has really informed how I think about myself as a Black woman in the world, and also how I think about us just as humans and the humanity that connects us outside of whatever our race or any other dimension of diversity. So yeah, that's what I'll say about my mom.
Oh,
Powerful. Yeah.
yeah.
Love that from both of you. Mr. Mayor, I wonder, you know, I have a 14-year-old son, Robert, who I think aspires to either the law or politics, but he wants to make a difference. There are lots of families here with girls. I have 4 sons. So I'm the counterbalance to all you. But I wonder what advice would you give to a young person who is thinking about politics, is thinking about a way to make a difference in his community, in his communities? Just what advice would you have? Politics has become, in some corners, a very messy, dirty kind of a business. I just wonder what counsel you might have.
I think politics becomes what we let it become. I mean, when I was looking at mayors, Chevara, I studied Mayor Rizzo in Philadelphia, and I studied Mayor Jackson. Decided I wanted to be a lot more like Mayor Jackson than Frank Rizzo. You know, I tell him to simply dream big dreams. I mean, he comes from an amazing lineage. So I'm sure living in your house, he understands the importance of history. And as I think as Charlamagne said earlier, you know, a lot of these things, if you want to talk about Black Wall Street, you want to talk about just the amazing accomplishments of African Americans during the Reconstruction, or radical Reconstruction, what happened in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, you know, right here in places like South Carolina. That if indeed he decides that he wants to get involved in politics, dream big. He can decide he wants to control his corner of the world, his city, his state, this country. I think anything is indeed possible, but you just got to be willing to be engaged. You got to be willing to do the work. You got to be able to understand that. And I think it's important to recognize that, particularly in this country, but a little bit everywhere, people in other parts of the world seem sometimes to be a bit more engaged in realizing that we are interdependent and interconnected. There's a bit of a vanity to Americans, in which I don't think we realize that the rest of the world is always out there. But recognize that everyone suffers from some degree of experiential blindness. That we bring our biases to the table. We understand that everybody doesn't have the same experiences we do. So, in your initial engagements with folks, you understand that you should always expect more. But you also should always be able to, and this is what I tell my 13-year-old all the time, my 15-year-old not as much, that I want you to have strongly held positions. Her positions are visceral. I mean, they come from here, and they come out. But I tell her she has to be prepared to defend her positions. I need you to do your research. I need you to understand how to articulate your position in a way so that whoever's coming at you from any direction, you can defend your position. Never compromise. Never compromise on the things that make you you. Your faith, your family, your personality. Be your authentic self. At the very same time, I want you to also be radically pragmatic. You got to solve problems if, in fact, you want to serve in public office. You got to commit yourself to actually being a solutions driven person. And realize that that in this country there will always be forces out there that seek to bury you. And the old quote is, they tried to bury me, but then they didn't realize we're seeds. They will try to bury you, but you've got to remain engaged. You got to remain persistent and vigilant in trying to live up to the dreams of the ancestors. A whole lot of folks gave a whole lot for us to be here, and I think if you keep your history behind you, but recognize that we're going straight forward, I believe that he can do anything he wants to do in this country. So I would encourage him, however, to definitely think about politics and service. We need more people. We need more good people involved.
Thank you. That was great. Last question. Share with us what's going on. What projects are you excited about? Are you working on something that you're ready to share with the public? Help us share with us something.
Charlamagne and I are going to be talking a little bit, if not tonight, but tomorrow about Wi-Fi and broadband. We were able to get some things into our state COVID funding from the federal government, CARES Act funding, to extend some broadband. There's so many different things to do. All these problems existed before the pandemic, but this has allowed some folks who either by design or maybe not, this has allowed us to shine an X-ray on America. I think about just about 5-6 months ago, and I'm not a big Bernie Sanders person, but 5-6 months ago, as we were talking about universal health care, it was unaffordable. You couldn't expand Medicaid to make sure folks had access to quality health care because it may cost $1 trillion, whatever it happens to be. And literally in less than 1 week, the federal government spent $3 trillion to try and respond to the pandemic. We'll probably do the same in the next several days or so. We've got to start effectively working on cures to these long-term illnesses that were there long before the coronavirus 2019 was. So we got some great things happening on everything from social justice to education to dealing with food insecurity, economic insecurity. Part of a wonderful group of mayors working on some pilots for mayors for a guaranteed income, looking at universal basic income as some ways to help folks deal with some of the income volatility we're facing in America. So a lot of exciting things here, as we look at the end of my third term as mayor.
Wonderful. Ilyasah, what about you? What are you working on? What do you got that you're excited about?
I have some things I'm really excited about that I can't mention, but the autobiography of Malcolm X, Audible, and my Growing Up X, Audible, comes out in September. So I'm excited about that. And as I mentioned, that was an experience. And I have another book coming out, The Awakening of Malcolm X, in February.
Wow.
And yeah.
That's wonderful.
The Audible is narrated by Lawrence Fishburne.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thank you, Charlamagne. The autobiography of Malcolm X, Audible, is narrated by Lawrence Fishburne.
Wow.
Yeah, and I also want to say for the mayor, make sure your girls, I'm sure they know already, understand the rich history on the continent, and the reason that these people were enslaved is because, well, prior to their enslavement, that they were farmers, scholars, priests, I think that is absolutely so key. And that was something that was very helpful for me. And that was something that I saw in a lot of young people that I was mentoring when I was very young, being empty of self-love because they didn't realize that their ancestry did not begin in slavery, but that it was because of all of this other greatness that corrupt people wanted.
Yeah, I'm going to do a whole show just on that.
Yeah,
I think that's profound. Chevara, what about you? What's going on with you?
So I've got a couple of projects. The story that I shared with you earlier about my mom and the rabbi, I'm filming a documentary, Why is Washington Still Burning? We started filming last September in Washington, D.C. Obviously, that's on hold because of COVID. And I'm also working on a book of the same name with Barrett Kohler Publishers. And I've got a civic engagement initiative here in South Florida that's really looking and scrutinizing the judiciary, making sure that our electorate has sufficient information to elect judges. You know, one of the unintended consequences of COVID is that judges across the nation, courtrooms across the nation have now turned into Zoom. What that means to some regard is that we have a different level of access, right? So you can go in and you can sit in and scrutinize, to the point that we were making earlier, that Charlamagne and the mayor made. When we think about the political power of this nation, that's not just the presidency and all of the judiciaries, which move all of the other policies that impact us, whether that's voting, that's the right to my body as a woman, right? All of that moved by judiciary. So to have a movement where we're encouraging young people to actually sit in. I was doing this before COVID. I was going in and observing court and taking notes and creating documents so that people could go in and sit and observe. And then we have a portal so that when it comes time to elect these judges, you've got real people who sat in these courtrooms and looked at bias, looked at the decisions that these judges are making. So that's one of the other initiatives that I'm working on now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Charlamagne, what about you?
I have a lot of things coming on the entertainment front. A few weeks ago, they announced that, you know, I'm doing a weekly talk show on Comedy Central. And
Excellent.
I'm definitely excited about that. And, you know, the Breakfast Club continues to grow. We're in 100 plus markets throughout the country. But, you know, the things I'm most, you know, that inspires me the most right now and really motivates me is like the work I'm doing around mental health. Mm-hmm. And, you know, just, you know, teaching these brothers is, you know, that it's okay to go out there and seek some healing. You know, Black people, we've dealt with so much trauma, generational trauma. And I think especially right now, one thing this pandemic made everybody do when they were sitting at home, it made them face themselves for the first time. And I think that has been a really new experience for a lot of brothers and sisters. I get so many phone calls and emails from Black men just wanting me to connect them with therapists and psychiatrists and grief counselors. They just want somebody to talk to. And like for me, I feel like everything is mental. And I feel like once we correct that part of ourselves, I just think the sky is the limit for Black people. Yeah. In a real way.
Yeah, we've been through a lot. But you know, look at where we are, and look at all of what we've given back. Had it not been for our ancestors, look what we did to this earth. I mean, to America.
That's right.
And had they not done all of the work that they've done, none of us would have the opportunity to call the United States of America our home. And we owe it to our enslaved ancestors. And so we have to make sure that we control that narrative and that information is in our children's educational curriculum.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Agree.
All right.
Well, this has been amazing. This has been a real highlight for me. And I want to thank each of you, Chevara, Ilyasah, Charlamagne, Steve. This has been just so great. It's been a gift what you've given our listeners. Thank you so much. I want to thank those of you who joined live, and look out for future events similar to this. And again, just thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Oh, thank you too. I learned so much on this call. This was great energy. Thank you, Queen Shabbazz. Thank you, Queen Chevara. Steve, I appreciate you, King. Michael, thank you, King. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Good night, y'all.
Okay.